What's up my channel? It is your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer here coming at you with another writing video. Today, by the time I'm posting this is going to be after NaNoWriMo, which means we are going from the writing phase of the writing process to the revisions and editing phase. Now, even if you plotted out your novel within an inch of its life, even if you plotted out every single little thing, of course, that means you're still going to have to go through it and polish some things up. You're still going to have to revise your plot, make sure there are no plot holes, etc. How do we do this? Well, everybody has a different strategy. You'll notice on AuthorTube, everybody has their own way of doing it. Everybody has their own way they suggest people do it. So here I am with how I revised my novel. Now, as we dive into this revision talk, please hit that like and subscribe button if you like what we're talking about so far, and comment below with your personal revision style. Here is my revision process. I'm going to talk about what I do, why I do it, and how I changed it from when I started to now. Number one, you're going to want to make sure that you change the format of your novel. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means however you're used to seeing your novel, you want to change that. If you were working in Scrivener, turn it into a Microsoft document. If you are used to using Google Docs or Microsoft Word, you can either change it into a different format. If you got Scrivener, you can change it back to Scrivener. That's actually how I like to do my developmental edits, where I'll be reading along, I'll be like, oh, scene change, all right, next thing. That's how I choose to do some of my revisions sometimes, especially when I'm trying to do the deep cuts, the deep developmental edits. That's how I find works easiest for me. You want to make sure you're changing the way you're used to seeing your novel. Now, why are we doing that? The thing is, when you're revising and you're editing your own work, especially if it's the way you're used to seeing it or the way you wrote it, it can be extremely difficult to kind of separate yourself, the different things that you did yourself, from the process that it took, and it's really difficult to kind of evaluate things objectively, because you could be reading a passage that, yeah, you worked really hard on, you stayed up till past midnight, 4 in the morning working on, but it might not be your best writing, and you might not recognize that because you're still a little too attached to the writing process and all the emotional labor you went through writing it. So the reason why we want to change up the format is because it kind of gives you a chance to look at it with fresh eyes. Now, how do we change the format? There are a bunch of different ways you can change your format really easily. Number one, you can always change the program you're using. If you were using Microsoft Word, switch to Google Docs. If you were using Scrivener, switch to Microsoft Word or Google Docs. If you want to do the other way around, you can always switch from Microsoft Word to Scrivener if that helps you out. That's what I suggest doing. That's usually what I end up doing, because I find it's easier for me to just write everything all at once on the same manuscript and then put it into Scrivener to kind of split up the scenes and move things around. That's how I work, but maybe you don't work like that. Whatever. You can also change the color or the font of whatever you're writing. This will give you a different view of everything. It'll just kind of change your perceptions. If you were working in black ink, change it to purple. If you were working in Times New Roman, maybe change it to Comic Sans if you're feeling a little silly. Whatever you want to do. The other thing you can do, which I think is probably the most popular, is you can print out your novel. Now, how did I come up with this list, you're probably wondering? Well, okay, so I've tried pretty much all of them, and I've already said which one's my favorite, and I'm gonna explain why right now. My first NaNoWriMo book was written in Microsoft Word, and my second NaNoWriMo book and my first Camp NaNoWriMo book were all written in Google Docs. Google Docs for me has just become really convenient because I can just do it whenever. If I'm on the train and I have a strike of inspiration, I can just start working on my phone or my tablet or whatever. It's just super convenient for me. Google Docs I highly recommend, especially for the drafting phase, because you just have access to it everywhere. Now, in the past, I have printed out my manuscript. That's what I did for my first book, and and I also did it for my second book as well. The reason I stopped was because I ran into some problems, and this was partly because of the point in my life where I was at. I was still in college, so it was a little bit more difficult for me in some regards. The problem that I encountered when I was printing things out, I don't think everybody encounters this, but it definitely happened for me, was that printing anything more than 50 pages is extremely difficult. Extremely difficult to do when you're at home if you're using your personal printer, because your personal printer just isn't really set up for it. And if you're printing out an entire book that you wrote on Microsoft Word, it's going to be a lot of pages. So when I was in college, that was a little bit easier because I was able to use the printers at school, and I just had printer credits, and I wasn't really using the printer credits anyway, so it was super easy because I could just kind of print like 100 pages. Even then, I still had a page cap where I could print like 100 pages and then kind of put it all together, or like put it into a binder, and then the next day I'd print out more pages, and then I'd put it all together in a binder, and then you can see how that would get a little monotonous, and it would just get really difficult to kind of print it all out at once. If you're going to print it out, I recommend you do, like, you go to Staples or whatever, and you have somebody else print it out, and you can also have it bound together so that way it is all in one cohesive thing. You can also make a cover for it as well if you're gonna have it bound. You know what? You might as well go all the way with it. Have a little fun. I know that's what I believe her YouTube name is, Ginger Reed Ainsley. I believe that's what she does. I actually watched one of her videos that I will link to down below in preparation for this, as I was trying to figure out how to verbalize what my revision process is. So anyway, so one of the issues that I encountered when I was trying to print it out was that I would try to put everything into one binder, because I love binders. I'm a total like Leslie Knope type A woman where I love binders and I love color coding things. So I had like this pretty pink binder that I put my manuscript into, and it worked for a little bit, but then the problem that I ran into was, as I was editing, I noticed that some of the pages would start ripping out, because you're just working in a binder, and I didn't have page protectors because I wanted to be able to write straight onto the page. And so the pages started ripping out. Some of the pages would start getting gross. So then I think I tried to switch to, instead of a binder, just having it in a huge binder clip, which worked because then they weren't ripping out of the little hole punches. But then I ran into a different issue because it was all just binder clips together, because I couldn't staple like 350 pages together. Like, that just wasn't happening. This was not possible with the supplies I had at the time. And because I had the huge binder clip, I noticed that the top page would start to get all wrinkly and gross. And then the bottom page would also get wrinkly and gross. And I mean, I was also in college at the time, so then just having this giant hunk of paper that looked like an entire stack of, it's probably like an entire ream of paper, just sitting in my dorm room. It's also just really hard to get some privacy with that, because it's such a giant thing of paper that I couldn't easily just put it away, so I ended up just leaving it on my desk. And then, I love my friends. They can be very nosy people. And so I would always get nervous because I don't like showing people my work until it's done and it's finished. I mean, like, I have a whole gallery wall up there of some stuff that I did like at paint and sets, and I don't even like doing that. I don't like anybody really looking at my work and judging it before I'm ready to show it to the world. So that was definitely a problem that I kept encountering, was that I couldn't really put it away, and I couldn't bring it around with me. I couldn't hide it in my bag because it was this massive hunk of paper, and that I couldn't really keep prying eyes away from it either. So personally, I don't really print it out, but it was really helpful for me to just kind of see everything in a different light, like literally. And it was really nice to be able to write on the page. So I do miss that part of being able to write on a printed piece of paper, but it just wasn't really worth the cons for me. I also noticed that when I would print out the paper, I think printing out your manuscript is a lot easier, is better for the editing process when you're doing the nitty-gritty, like syntactic and semantic editing, when you're just kind of changing your grammar and your word choices and stuff like that. But I also noticed that for me personally, I didn't really like doing the revisions that way, because I would get hung up on the nitty-gritty details. Like, I would be changing the spelling of things when I was really supposed to be looking at the developmental issues in my manuscript. I was supposed to be looking for things like plot holes, when I used the wrong character name, when the plot didn't really make sense, when there were contradictions within my manuscripts, and of course when somebody did something out of character. I was supposed to be keeping track of those 5 things, but because it was printed out and I was just used to editing that sort of way, I found myself not really paying that much attention to that. I find edits like that is a lot easier to do than revisions. Another issue I encountered with a printed manuscript that you avoid when you just stick with digital and you just change the literal format of it or the literal font and color of the text. It was really difficult for me to transfer the edits and the suggestions that I was making on the physical copy into my digital document and kind of make those updates, because even if you have page numbers, the second you start to shift things around on the digital document, it immediately changes everything. And then things wouldn't line up while I was trying to edit the rest of the book, because I had just moved like one scene that was in the middle to like a whole chunk that was in the middle to the beginning of the story, or vice versa, and it would kind of mess up the flow of the pages and whatnot. And even just making the simple little edits, like the little line edits here and there, like changing a character's name or changing a sentence, would also affect that. And for me personally, it really started to bother me. It really started to just grate on me, so that's when I just decided to stop and I just stuck with digital. So that's my argument for digital. I do miss just like feeling the pages in my hand. There's just something so nice about like holding the physical manuscripts in your hands. I will say that I do miss that feeling. So if you're more of an analog person, I recommend you print out your copy, but please make sure you get it bound. Please make sure you don't let it get all gross like I did. So yeah, once you change the format of your manuscripts, you can also do this next step either before the first one, or you can do it as you're writing as well. You want to make/finish your story Bible. Now this is a term that I also found in that video from Ginger Reads Ainsley, and I think it kind of just hits the nail on the head. I think it's pretty much the perfect term to use to describe the document that you will create, and you will create this whether you think you're going to or not, to help you just keep track of everybody. You're keeping track of your characters, you're keeping track of the different settings and the places, you're keeping track of all the little nitty-gritty, the lore details that you like to throw around, which is especially helpful if you are doing a science fiction or a fantasy piece. You want to use this to keep track of your town names, your character names, the things that they like, the things that they don't like, who their relatives are, etc. You want to use your story Bible to keep track of everything. Now, why do you need a story Bible when you're working on revisions? Well, like I was saying before, you want to make sure that there's consistency in your manuscript. You don't want one character to go from having a brother to having a sister, unless that was intentional. You want to make sure you can keep track of everything. You don't want to mess up, you don't want characters talking about their parents and then messing up their names halfway through the book. You also don't want people messing up the name of the town they're in, because that's always awkward. So again, you have a couple of different options for this. You can write out a physical one and make it a binder. That's especially good if you're an analog person. That can be really helpful if you enjoy like flipping through the pages. I personally don't, but not everyone's me. You can also make a separate Word document, which is what I usually end up doing in the drafting phase. I think I heard on like an interview, I think Alexa Dunn did the interview with someone, and this author was talking about how she will set up a wiki, like a Wikipedia thing, or like a wiki fandom for this book. She'll make it secret, of course, because otherwise people are going to be poking around being like, what's this? But she'll set up an entire wiki of the different lore and kind of interconnect it that way. To me, that sounds really cool, but also a little complicated, especially because I'm a pantser, so I usually don't have things fleshed out enough to kind of hyperlink everything together. But that's another option that you can do, and I believe that is free, so free is good. Scrivener also has a separate section for you to put all the details like that. I think you have like a character list, and they even have like set up worksheets. I swear, I'm not sponsored by Scrivener. I just really enjoy their product. But you can actually set up different character worksheets where you talk about their favorite color, their different physical attributes, blah, 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 and their names and who they're related to and that sort of thing. You can color code it. You can also do that with settings as well in Scrivener. But regardless of how you create your story Bible, it's completely necessary that you have it. And it's also extremely necessary that you have it on Quick Draw while you are writing. You can just have it up in the background as you're editing, or as you're writing as well. I'm a pantser, so I find I just edit it as I go. I bet a lot of outliners kind of have this stuff figured out before they start writing, which is also super helpful. But by the time you're done with your novel, a couple of things at the very least will have changed. So by the time you're done, you want to make sure you have that complete and ready. You also might have to make edits to it while you're revising. You might decide, ooh, maybe that character is actually an only child and they don't have a younger sister like I wrote. Or maybe the town name should be Village Land instead of Stars Hollow. You want to make sure that you are revising and you are updating your story Bible as you are updating your story. If the two do not match, you're going to have continuity errors. You're going to have plot holes that you didn't realize you had. Do not skip the story Bible step. You can move it around and do it before you're ready to revise or after you've printed out your manuscript and changed the format, but you need to make sure you have a story Bible. It is not a skippable step. This next tip is something that I picked up from a Shaylin Writes video, and she says to split your novel up into scenes. Now what she does is she makes the outline as she's writing, and she'll write down chapter 1, scene 1A to go with the chapter, and she'll kind of keep track, and like she'll write out like chapter 1, Harry goes to school, scene 1A, Harry finds out he's a wizard, etc. I don't know, Harry Potter's always my go-to, I apologize. She talks about this more in depth in her revisions map video, which I will link to down below because that goes a bit more in depth in what she personally does, but this isn't her channel, this is my channel. So I'm going to talk about what I do. So what I always do, I usually do this after I'm done writing because then I have a more cohesive idea of what scenes go into what and what scenes should flow into what or what scenes should be moved around. But anyway, so what I do is I always split everything up into scenes. Talked about that in one of my previous videos because splitting things up into scenes just makes it so much less intimidating that way. A lot of times when you are at the revising stage, even if you think your manuscript is perfect, there are going to be some scenes that you feel the need to take out or some scenes that you think might work better in the beginning of your story than wherever they ended up. And it is just so much easier to just move an entire scene as opposed to just move that particular scene than to kind of figure out where the scene ends and flows into the next one. It gets very confusing. Now I've done the whole copy and paste the whole chunk of your story into a different chunk of your story. It just makes it really messy. So I do this on Scrivener. I recommend you can do Shaylin's approach, which is a lot different than mine. I do this on Scrivener. I swear I'm not sponsored by Scrivener, but hey guys, I'm here and I'm interested. The next thing you're going to do, of course, is you're going to read through your novel. Duh. And you're going to make comments, not changes. And this is something that's a lot easier to do in print format or in Microsoft Word and Google Docs. I personally still have not figured out how to make comments in Scrivener. I'm sure there's a way, I just haven't figured it out. But you want to make sure you're making comments and keeping track of the different changes you want to make. However, you don't want to make all those changes yet. Now the reason why is because a novel is I mean, you would know this better than anyone. A novel is a pretty long story. So you could end up feeling one way at the beginning or whenever you feel like making the change, and then by the end of the book you're like, no, wait, that actually works. I don't want to change that anymore. But if you've already changed it, you're going to forget what you did, and then you're going to have to reread it, and you might end up liking it, but you might end up actually going back, blah, 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 blah. You don't want to make any big changes just yet until you've seen the flow and cohesiveness of the overall piece. If you're doing a developmental edit, which is usually what I end up doing when I'm revising, you want to make sure your developmental edit is based off of your overall impression of the work and not how you felt in the moment with a particular scene. Now, of course, you want to make sure you're keeping track of your different scene breaks. You want to make sure you're recognizing where certain scenes don't make that much sense, and you want to keep track of those different comments, and you want to break things up into scenes as well for when you end up doing the different edits. If you change things as you go along and you change things as you're reading them, you can get caught in an endless loop of changes. Now, why do I say that? Because I'm speaking from experience. This is something that happened to me with my book that I'm currently having edited through the Young Writers Program, which I will link to down below. I'm also having another book beta read by them as well, and that's because it's just really difficult. It's really difficult when you're trying to edit as you read through your manuscript, because then you just start second guessing yourself, which is literally what happened to me. You can get to a point where you're just stuck in this endless loop of editing, that's not good, editing again, that's still not good, and going back and editing, that's still not good, and just you get filled with so much self-doubt that it's really difficult for you to pull yourself out. You just kind of need another person's opinion to basically pat you on the back and be like, you can trust your instincts, you're good, you're fine, you're okay. You will probably end up needing another set of eyes to look at it if you get stuck in the self-editing loop that I got stuck in. And it's really helpful to have another person look at it, but it's also kind of frustrating because you're like, if I just trusted myself, I could have been done by now. The only thing I suggest you change as you're writing is any spelling errors or anybody's name that you mess up, that you miswrote or used the wrong name in a certain spot, because if you're doing the big revisions first, you're not really going to remember that until the second time you read through. So it's just easier if you, those are the only things I recommend changing. After you're done with your first read through, you've made all your comments and everything, I suggest you take a break. Now, when I say take a break, I don't mean a couple of months, I don't mean a couple of years, I mean a couple of days where you don't think about your novel, you don't look at the documents, you just do a complete reset in your brain. You need that break because you need time to digest what happened in your story. You need time to kind of mull over the big changes you want to make. So I suggest you take a couple of days. I think 3 would probably be the max. And then you go back to your story, you go through your different comments, and you decide which ones you want to actually follow through with and which ones you don't. Now, you may end up just following through with all of them, and that's totally fine. I recommend you do that if you trust your gut, but you need that time away from your novel to just calm yourself down, because I know personally when I'm editing, I can be really harsh on myself. And so I will write really mean comments to myself, and then I need time to just kind of step away, come back, and then I'll be a little bit nicer to myself and be like, no, that wasn't that bad. The sentence is but not the best sentence in the world, but it's not a tragedy and a crime against writing. Like, having these buffer days can also help you just kind of reset the creative juices, refill the well. And then, of course, once you're done with those buffer days, you want to jump right in and start those revisions. Now, I recommend when you're making those changes that you start with the big changes first and then work your way down. I think there's like an upside down triangle. That's how you work. You start with the big changes and then you go down to the nitty gritty stuff, the spelling changes, the continuity errors, etc. I am linking to the videos that I watched to help me with this topic down below for your perusal, of course. That's all I've got for you today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like and subscribe button so I know you want me to post more content like this. And please make sure you subscribe. I post new videos on Wednesdays, usually at 12 o'clock. So, without further ado, happy revising!